Welcome to another report on the war in Ukraine. This is the account with the daily news for day 315. There was nothing major reported today. However, we have some updates on the Makiivka strike, an interview by ABC News with Ukraine's military intelligence head Kyrylo Budanov, and one article I want to point out. We will go over those first before we move on to the regular news segment with the situation inside Ukraine, the occupied territories, and the international developments. First, though, the flashpoints along the front. Crimea. There's not much to report here. Geolocated footage indicates that Dibrova is contested, with Russian units shelling Ukrainian units to the north and just to the west of the settlement. Bakhmut. Mostly back and forth fighting happening around the settlement. Ukrainian forces repelled attacks at Soledar, Krasnahora, and Bakhmut. Ukrainian forces reported that during a failed attack by Russia, they managed to counterattack and capture enemy positions. Additionally, 2 enemy ammunition depots were destroyed in the Bakhmut area. The commander of the ground forces of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Colonel General Alexander Syrskyi, reported Russian units had orders to capture Soledar and encircle Bakhmut by December 26th. And now, before the news segment, the article I want to highlight. It is titled Hell in High Definition. Inside Frontline Aerial Unit Surveilling Battle of Bakhmut. The article follows Ukrainian drone operators from the Skala Battalion. They are tasked with aerial reconnaissance and assault operations and have been posted in Bakhmut since last autumn. Few can judge the progress of the Battle of Bakhmut better than these soldiers. According to them, Russian soldiers have a clear method to their tactics. They are not just relying on mindless wave attacks as they are often described in the media. Please go check out this article, it is highly interesting. And now a look at the latest developments regarding the Ukrainian strike on Makiivka. The Russian Ministry of Defense has reported 89 soldiers killed in Makiivka. Among them is the regiment's deputy commander, Lieutenant Colonel Bachurin. While far from the number of 400 killed reported by Ukraine, it is one of the largest losses Russia has admitted to in the war. The New York Times also mentioned the attack on Makiivka as the worst military loss since Russia started the invasion. Family members of soldiers killed gathered in Samara, waving Russian flags and calling for revenge. Russian authorities have started using their usual rhetoric. Blame is focused on the West and on what critics describe as incompetent officials. Additionally, it is reported that Russia has yet to compile lists of the killed soldiers and allegedly has made plans to get rid of survivors by sending them to the front. Family members desperately try to find their relatives and which hospital they might have been taken to, but no one is receiving an answer. It is suggested Russia is trying to cover up the whole event. Meanwhile, it is reported that the Russian Defense Ministry is blaming the attack on soldiers, ignoring the ban on use of mobile phones. According to the report, mobile phones were used excessively and Ukraine managed to locate the signals. The speaker of the Eastern Group of Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Sergei Cherevati, called this ridiculous. Moving on to the ABC News interview with Ukraine's military intelligence head, Kyrylo Budanov. Russia is not a military threat to the world anymore, just a tall tale. Kyrylo Budanov, head of the Chief Intelligence Directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, described the Russian regime as a laughingstock for everyone during his interview with ABC News. He went on to say that only Russia's nuclear arsenal and uncontrollable regime is left, and the world will have to realize denuclearization of Russia is a necessity. During his interview, he also talked about Ukraine planning a serious counteroffensive and that the fighting on the front line in March will be the hottest. He further recalled his visit to Bakhmut and that the corpses of Russian soldiers literally litter the front lines there. The fighters showed me a sector where corpses are piled up, just like in a movie. Hundreds of corpses are just rotting in an open field. In places, they are piled on top of other bodies like makeshift walls. When Russian troops attack in this field, they use these bodies for cover like a shield. But it does not work, he said. When asked by a journalist during the interview if Putin is sick, Budanov replied, "Of course, he has been sick for a long time, very long time." He believes that Russian President Vladimir Putin has cancer and expressed hope for his quick death before the end of the war. And now the latest news on the situation inside Ukraine. The New York Times published an article about Ukraine shooting down cheap drones with expensive missiles. But it is not possible to compare the two, said the spokesman of the Air Force of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Yuri Ignat. You cannot put a price on a threat to the lives of civilians. The Prosecutor General's office reported that Russia has committed 62,210 war crimes since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. President Zelensky believes Russia will give the order to deploy its entire military force in order to achieve results in Ukraine. This must become Russia's final failure, according to him. Moving on to the latest from the occupied territories. Petro Andriushchenko, advisor to the Mariupol mayor, reports that Russia has started to turn the harbour in Mariupol into a military base. According to him, all citizens working at the docks were dismissed and workers from Russia brought in. Work has begun on the berths to divide them into civilian and military ones. Ukraine is currently monitoring the delivery of building materials and containers with unknown content. Ukraine's defense intelligence is reporting new military units being deployed to northern Crimea. The report suggests these units will be used to make every effort to hold the land corridor to Crimea. Andriy Chernyak, a representative of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry's main intelligence directorate, stated that Russia is losing and that is the reason they are building fortifications. The General Staff of Ukraine reported about plans by mobilized Luhansk residents to surrender the moment Ukrainian forces manage to break through Russian defenses. According to Yevhen Yerin, the spokesman of the defense forces of the Tavria region, Russia has begun fortifying areas in the occupied Zaporizhzhia Oblast. In the Kherson Oblast, Russia is increasingly using sabotage and reconnaissance units. And to wrap up the news segment, the latest international developments. According to the latest assessment by the Institute for the Study of War, Putin has confirmed that Russia is using schemes to transfer Ukrainian children to Russia. Especially holiday and vacation schemes have proven effective, and Putin thanked Russians for their efforts. Local residents reported explosions being heard in Rostov-on-Don and Kursk. Footage shared on social media shows flashes in the sky and the sounds of explosions. Vadim Shubitsky, a representative of the main Directorate of Intelligence of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, stated Russia has used about 660 out of the 1,750 ordered Shahed drones. Currently, Russia is waiting for a new batch of 250 to 300 UAVs, and meanwhile is preparing missiles for another major attack. Dmitry Rogozin, the former Director General of Roscosmos, has sent one of the shrapnel pieces taken from his body to the French ambassador to be given to President Macron. According to Rogozin, he was hit by a French 155mm self-propelled howitzer Caesar, and France would have to pay the price. In a cynical statement, he went on to say hundreds of innocent civilians have been killed by French weapons and French mercenaries in the Donbass, but neglected to mention how many have been killed by Russia. Meanwhile, France has become the first Western country to pledge light tanks to Ukraine. However, it is unclear when the vehicles will be transferred. Hervé Blejean, the Director General of the European Union Military Staff, reported that Russia has suffered at least 250,000 casualties in the war. According to him, 60,000 were killed and 3 times as many wounded. In his statement, he also mentioned Russia having lost 60% of the total reserve of military tanks, 70% of its missile reserve capable of hitting ground targets, 40% of armored combat vehicles, and 20% of artillery. He further estimated that Kyiv would need about 75,000 soldiers for planned offensive operations in spring 2023. And now for the daily intelligence updates. Starting with the UK Ministry of Defence. On December 31, 2022, Ukraine struck a school building in the Russian-held town of Makiivka near Donetsk city, which Russia had almost certainly taken over for military use. The building was completely destroyed and, as the Russian MOD confirmed, 89 Russian personnel were killed. Given the extent of the damage, there is a realistic possibility that ammunition was being stored near to troop accommodation, which detonated during the strike, creating secondary explosions. The building was only 12.5 kilometers from the Avdiivka sector front line, one of the most intensely contested areas of the conflict. The Russian military has a record of unsafe ammunition storage from well before the current war, but this incident highlights how unprofessional practices contribute to Russia's high casualty rate. And to wrap up the report, the evening update by the General Staff of Ukraine. The enemy continues to move personnel, weapons, military equipment, and ammunition to the areas of hostility. In addition to rail transportation, it uses military transport and civil aviation. The enemy is concentrating its efforts on conducting offensive actions in the Liman, Bakhmut, and Avdiivka areas, and is trying to improve the tactical position in the Kupiansk area. In Novopavlovsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, the enemy leads the defense. Conducts engineering equipment of positions and mining of terrain along the left bank of the Dnipro River. In the city of Luhansk, in the neurological department of the Luhansk Regional Clinical Hospital, the occupiers are treating more than 100 mercenaries of the private military company Wagner. Regarding enemy losses, on January 3rd, fire damage was confirmed to the concentration of manpower and military equipment of the occupiers in the Tokmak settlement of the Zaporizhzhia region. The losses of the enemy amounted to about 80 soldiers wounded and dead. And with that, today's news report is finished. You can find links to any of the articles I mentioned in the description below. Thank you for tuning in and have a great day. You were listening to The Account. Slava Ukraini.